Imagine a man so dangerous that Texas branded him a killer. And then, a few years later, that same man is wearing a badge, calling himself a lawman, and deciding who lives and who dies on the frontier. That man was Frank Canton. At least that's the name history remembers. The story of Frank Canton begins far from the legends and gunsmoke of the Wild West. It begins with a quiet boy named Josiah Horner. Born in Virginia in 1849, nobody who saw him as a child could have guessed he would grow up to wear a badge, command armed men, or ride at the center of one of the most violent conflicts in frontier history. Nobody imagined he would leave behind his real name, bury his past, and live a second life under a new identity. But that is exactly what he did. Josiah, known simply as Joe, grew up like thousands of other frontier children, surrounded by hard work, rough land, and endless uncertainty. When he was young, his family moved to Texas, a place where the wind never stopped blowing and the land made strong men or broke them. Texas in the 1800s was wild, open, and often ruled by the strongest hands rather than the written law. For a young boy like Joe, it was the perfect place to learn skills he would later depend on: riding long distances, handling cattle, using a gun, and surviving harsh conditions. As he grew older, Joe became a working cowboy. He rode dusty trails from sunrise to sunset, moving herds of cattle toward the markets in Kansas. He slept under the stars, cooked his meals over small campfires, and worked beside men who lived rough and talked rough. Life was simple, but it was hard. Cowboys earned little money, and every job came with danger storms, stampedes, rattlesnakes, and sometimes armed men who wanted the cattle for themselves. Joe watched powerful ranch owners grow richer while men like him risked their lives for small pay. He saw that the frontier had two kinds of people: those who owned everything, and those who worked for the ones who owned everything. Somewhere inside him, disappointment began to grow. He was tired of low wages and long days. He wanted more than a bedroll on the ground and a few coins in his pocket. This desire for a better life, mixed with the wild nature of frontier society, slowly pushed him toward a different path. People say every outlaw has a moment where he chooses the road he will walk. For Joe, that moment came quietly at first. It began with cattle rustling, stolen calf here, a missing steer there. Many cowboys did it at times, especially when hungry or desperate. But Joe began to see it as an opportunity, not just a survival trick. It felt easy, too easy. A few animals taken from a large herd could bring quick money with almost no questions asked. The more he did it, the more confidence he gained. Joe became skilled at sneaking cattle away from herds, changing brands, and selling animals before anyone could trace them. Soon he was known among certain circles as a man who was not afraid to cross the line. And once a man crosses that line in the West, it is hard to return. The land forgives storms and droughts, but it never forgets a thief. Then came 1874, the year that changed Joe Horner's life forever. That year, he became more than a rustler. He became a wanted killer. The incident happened near the frontier, where two Buffalo soldiers, black cavalrymen serving the United States Army, crossed paths with Joe. The details are lost to time. Nobody knows exactly what words were said or what started the argument. But the frontier was a place where tempers ran hot and weapons were always within reach. In a matter of seconds, a fight turned into a gun battle. Shots echoed across the dry Texas land. When the smoke cleared, one soldier lay dead. The other was wounded badly. Joe knew instantly that he was no longer just a thief. He was a murderer in the eyes of the law. Texas officers began hunting for him. Wanted posters started to appear. Joe's name became a warning spoken in town saloons. But Joe did not stop. Instead, he kept riding where the law was thin and opportunities were wide. For a time, he managed to stay ahead of the men tracking him. But his luck finally ended in 1877, when he was arrested for bank robbery in Comanche, Texas. The outlaw who believed he could outrun every consequence was now behind bars. Too many men. Prison is the end of the story. But for Joe Horner, it became the beginning of a new one. He would not let iron bars or a locked door decide his fate. Sometime during his imprisonment, no one knows how or when Joe escaped. It may have been during a work detail, or perhaps he slipped out during a transfer. Whatever happened, The result was the same. Joe vanished from Texas and left nothing behind but his crimes and a trail of unanswered questions. What came next would shape the rest of his life. As he rode north, far from the land where he was hunted, he began to imagine a new version of himself, one who didn't have a criminal past, one who could walk into a town without fear, one who could become powerful instead of powerless. By the time he reached the high plains of Wyoming, Joe made a decision that would rewrite his destiny. He dropped the name Josiah Horner forever and created a new identity, one that sounded strong, respectable, and official. He became Frank M. Canton. No one in Wyoming had heard of Joe Horner. No one knew his crimes. No one suspected the quiet, steady cowboy who arrived looking for work. Frank Canton spoke with confidence, carried himself like a man with nothing to hide, and quickly built a reputation as reliable and fearless. The outlaw had died on the trail. The lawman was about to be born. When Joe Horner stepped into Wyoming as Frank M. Canton, he walked through the world like a man reborn. He spoke little, listened much, and carried himself with calm confidence. Out on the wide Wyoming plains, he did not seem like an outlaw on the run. He looked like any other cowboy searching for honest work. And that was the beauty of it. No one questioned him. No one recognized him. In a place full of wanderers and men chasing new beginnings, a new name was as good as a clean slate. Wyoming, in the early 1880s, was a land growing fast. More cattle were coming in every year. Vast herds grazed on the open range, and rich ranchers fought silently for control of land, water, and reputation. The powerful Wyoming Stock Growers Association, known simply as the WSGA, was the heart of this new empire. Its members owned huge ranches, thousands of cattle, and unofficially much of the law in the territory. Frank Canton walked right into this world at the perfect time. He had skills they respected. He had a quiet nature they trusted, and he had a past they knew nothing about. Canton first worked as a cowboy and ranch hand. He fixed fences, rounded up strays, and rode long distances without complaint. His calm attitude and steady hands made him stand out. He did not drink much. He did not brag. He stayed out of trouble and kept his eyes open. Wyoming cattlemen respected men who worked hard and talked little. Soon they noticed something else about him. He was good with a gun. Very good, Canton never showed off. But when trouble came to a ranch, or when they needed someone to confront a suspected thief, he handled himself with cold focus. The big ranch owners liked that. They did not want a loud gunslinger. They wanted a man who could act without fear and without making a show of it. So they gave him a new job, a job that fit him strangely well. He became a stock detective, polite name for a hired gun who protected cattle herds, investigated rustlers, and made sure the big cattle companies kept their power. It was the exact opposite of who he once was. Joe Horner stole from ranchers. Frank Canton hunted men who did the same. But in some twisted way, this new role felt natural to him. Maybe he believed he was making up for his old sins. Maybe he enjoyed the authority. Maybe he simply wanted to survive in a place where the powerful decided a man's future. Whatever the reason, Frank Canton became one of the most trusted enforcers the WSGA had ever hired. Life for him changed quickly after that. He now had respect. He now had influence. He walked through town wearing clean clothes, carrying a revolver that people noticed but didn't question. He even made friends among the territory's most important men. They invited him to dinners, asked his advice, and soon began to speak of him as a man who could help bring order to the county. In truth, order often meant keeping small ranchers in their place and protecting the interests of the wealthy. Canton's rise reached a new level in 1885 when he ran for sheriff of Johnson County, and think about that. A man who had once escaped a Texas jail was now wearing the badge of the law. As Sheriff Canton carried himself with confidence. He did not smile much. He rarely raised his voice. But he had a presence that made people step aside when he walked down the street. Under his watch, Johnson County became a place where small ranchers felt watched, and big ranchers felt safe. Whispers followed him wherever he went. He's too close to the big outfits. He only listens to the rich. He's dangerous if you cross him. But Canton did not care. He believed in order. He believed in loyalty. And he believed in finishing what he started. Then came the incident that still shadows his name, the murder of John Tisdale, a well-liked small rancher who had openly challenged the power of the big cattlemen. Tisdale was shot and killed one cold evening, and many people quickly pointed fingers at the WSGA. Some believed Canton had played a role. Others believed he at least knew more than he said. He was arrested for the killing, but the case collapsed. The cattle barons rallied behind him, hired top lawyers, and the charges quietly disappeared. The law had spoken, but the people did not forget. After his release, Canton returned to his duties as sheriff, but the county was changing. More settlers were moving in. More small ranches were opening. The tension between the little men and the big men was growing like a storm on the horizon. The WSGA believed rustling was spreading. Small ranchers believed the WSGA was using the rustler, labeled to crush competition. Canton stood firmly on the side he trusted most, the side that had saved him from his past, given him a new name, and offered him real power. But deep down, he remained the same man who once rode away from Texas with nothing but a new name and a loaded gun. A man who survived by choosing the winning side. A man who understood that the frontier respected strength far more than honesty. And as the years passed, the storm grew darker. Accusations grew louder. Fear grew sharper. Wyoming was moving toward a breaking point, one that would explode in violence and pull Frank Canton into the center of one of the most famous range wars in American history. The outlaw had become a sheriff, but the old fire inside him had never truly gone out. By the late 1880s, Frank Canton had become one of the most talked about men in Johnson County. Some people respected him, others feared him, and many did both. To strangers, he looked like a strong, quiet sheriff keeping the peace. But to the small ranchers and settlers, he was a reminder that power in Wyoming belonged to the cattle barons, not the common people. The open range of Wyoming was changing. More families were arriving, building small cabins near rivers and creeks, planting crops, and starting their own herds. These newcomers were called nesters. They believed they had just as much right to the land as anyone else. But the big cattle companies saw them as a threat, people crowding land the barons had long controlled. This tension grew stronger every season. It grew in saloons, in dusty stores, around campfires, and along fence lines. People whispered it like a warning. Something bad is coming. And at the center of it all was Sheriff Frank Canton, stood firmly with the powerful Wyoming Stock Growers Association. He believed, or at least he claimed to believe, that most small ranchers were rustlers, stealing cattle from the big herds. Sometimes he was right, many times he was wrong. But Canton rarely questioned the motives of the men who paid him, supported him, and protected him. Loyalty, for him, was a simple thing. Stand with those who stand with you. During this time, several suspicious killings shook the county. One of the most talked about deaths was that of John Tisdale, a respected local rancher known for being outspoken against the WS. People liked Tisdale. He was fair, generous, and vocal when he believed injustice was taking place. When he was shot and killed, the community demanded answers. Rumors exploded like dry grass catching fire. Canton knows something. Canton helped plan it. Canton was nearby that night. Nothing was proven in court. Canton was arrested, but powerful cattlemen came to his defense. The charges fell apart quickly. Some believed the evidence vanished because of influence and money. Others believed Canton was simply too careful to be caught. Whatever the truth, the people of Johnson County did not forget. To them, this was proof that the law did not protect everyone equally. Canton returned to his duties, but his presence now stirred more fear than trust. When he rode into a town, conversations went silent. When he stepped into a saloon, men moved aside. When he questioned someone about missing cattle, families worried about what might happen next. But Canton did not slow down. He did not back away. He believed he was doing what needed to be done. At night, when he sat alone in his small office, he may have thought about the life he had left behind in Texas, the life where he was the hunted instead of the hunter. Maybe he was determined never to be that powerless again. Maybe he believed that strength was the only way to survive on the frontier. Or maybe the line between justice and violence had grown too blurry for him to see anymore. As the years passed, frustration among the small ranchers grew like the rising wind before a storm. They believed that WSGA used its power unfairly, branding nearly every small rancher a rustler without proof. Some of these families had worked the land for decades and were tired of being treated like criminals. Their complaints reached newspapers, traveled across the state, and echoed through the halls of government. But nothing changed. Behind closed doors, the cattle barons began to whisper about a solution, one that would be quick, final, and deadly. They talked about forming a large force of hired gunmen. They talked about creating a list of rustlers who needed to be eliminated. And they needed a man who knew the land, knew the people, and had no fear of blood on his hands. They needed Frank Canton. Canton listened quietly as the plan took shape. He understood what they wanted. He understood what it meant. And deep inside, he accepted it. To him, this was not murder. This was order. This was control. This was the way the frontier worked, when the law failed and men believed they must take matters into their own hands. He began gathering names. Names of men accused of rustling. Names of men who spoke against the WSGA. Names of men who challenged the powerful. Some of these men had done nothing wrong. Some had only spoken too loudly or taken land. The cattle barons considered theirs. But Canton did not argue. He wrote the names carefully. He prepared for what was coming. At the same time, small ranchers prepared as well, not for violence, but for survival. They felt pressure growing from all sides. Some talked about leaving the area. Others talked about standing their ground. Fear hung over the ranches like a dark cloud that never moved. Winter passed, spring arrived, and with it came the moment the WSGA had been planning for. A private army began to form, made up of hired gunmen from Texas and local tough men willing to follow orders. They gathered quietly, traveling under cover of darkness, riding into Wyoming in small groups to avoid drawing attention. They carried rifles, ammunition, food, and rope, and they were paid well. Very well. At the head of this force stood Frank Canton, now not just a sheriff, not just a stock detective, but the field leader of a deadly mission. The men under his command called themselves regulators. The people of Johnson County would later call them something else entirely: the invaders. They planned to ride into the county, capture or kill every man on their list, and break the spirit of the small ranchers once and for all. Canton looked at the listisms of names, then folded it and placed it inside his coat. He knew every trail, every ranch, every creek crossing. He knew exactly where the men on that list lived. The sun had barely risen when he gave the order to move out. More than 50 armed men rode behind him. Dust rose from their horses' hooves. Steel glinted in the light. A silent, terrible mission had begun. Frank Canton believed this would bring order. He believed this would end chaos. But instead, it would start one of the bloodiest conflicts in the history of the American West. The storm had arrived, and Canton was riding right at the center of it. The sun rose slowly over the Wyoming plains as Frank Canton led a column of horses across the open land. The morning air was cold, but the mission ahead burned hot in the minds of every rider. More than 50 armed men followed Canton gunmen hired from Texas, stock detectives, and loyal supporters of the powerful cattle barons. They had come for one purpose: to strike fear into Johnson County and destroy everyone the Wyoming Stock Growers Association believed stood against them. Inside Canton's coat was the most dangerous piece of paper in the West, a death list. Dozens of names, some accused of rustling, some guilty of nothing more than speaking their minds. To the WSGA, these men were enemies. To Canton, they were targets. To the small ranchers and settlers, they were neighbors, friends, fathers, brothers. The private army moved quietly, avoiding towns, slipping through coulees and lowlands to stay hidden. They traveled with a wagon full of rifles, ammunition, dynamite, and provisions. There was no plan for arrests, no plan for trials. Everything about this mission was built on one belief: the law had failed, so the powerful would now make their own law. At the front rode Canton.com, as ever, his face unreadable. He knew the land better than any man in the group. Every turn, every creek crossing, Every ranch house he had traveled these trails as sheriff, and now he traveled them as an invader. Their first destination, the KC Ranch, a small home owned by two men on the death list, Nate Champion and Nick Ray. The group reached the KC Ranch before dawn. The sky was still gray, and the frost on the ground crunched softly under horses' hooves. Canton ordered his men into position. They surrounded the house in a wide circle, rifles ready, eyes sharp. No one inside the ranch had any idea what was coming. Nick Ray stepped outside first. He had just begun his morning routine when the silence was shattered by a rifle shot. The bullet struck him before he could react. He collapsed near the doorway, bleeding and gasping for breath. Inside the house, Nate Champion realized he was trapped. He moved quickly, dragging Ray inside, but Nick was already fading. Champion peered through a window and saw dozens of riders closing in. He was alone, outnumbered, and surrounded by men who had come to kill him. Canton watched calmly from a distance. He had no interest in negotiations. He wanted to finish the job quickly and move on to the next names on the list. But Nate Champion refused to die quietly. The gunfight began. Champion fired from windows, doorways, and cracks in the walls. Bullet after bullet slammed into the ranch house, but he continued to hold them off. Hours passed as smoke filled the rooms and splinters flew from shattered boards. Every time a gunman tried to rush the door, Champion shot back with deadly aim. Canton grew impatient. This was supposed to be easy to men against 50, but Champion fought like a man who had nothing to lose. Every hour he bought gave the people of Johnson County a better chance to learn what was happening. Inside the burning house, Nate Champion paused long enough to write a few lines in his diary. His handwriting was shaky, but his words were strong. They are shooting at the house all the time. I guess they intend to burn me out. He knew he was alone. He knew he would not survive. But he kept fighting. By late afternoon, Canton made a decision. He ordered the house set on fire. Flames licked the walls, quickly turning wood to ash. Smoke billowed into the sky. Champion coughed, struggled to breathe, and staggered from window to window. He knew the end had come. At last, he stepped outside, coughing rifle in hand, determined to go down fighting. He fired a final shot before a storm of bullets struck him. Nate Champion fell to the ground, his body riddled with gunfire. The men gathered around his lifeless form. Some felt a shadow of guilt. Others felt relief. Canton felt nothing. He looked at the body, then at the death list inside his coat. One name crossed out, many more to go. But Champion's stand changed everything. Smoke rising from the KC Ranch carried a message that spread across the county like wildfire. The invaders are here. They have come to kill. While Canton's force prepared to move on to their next targets, news traveled fast. Ranchers mounted their horses. Settlers ran door to door, shouting warnings. Anger and fear spread through Johnson County like a rising tide. The people would not let this pass. Not this time. Not after Champion died as the sun set behind the hills. Canton and his men rode toward their next target. They felt confident, sure of victory, convinced that the WSGA's power would shield them from consequences. But the world around them was changing. The people of Johnson County were gathering. Men who had never agreed on anything were now united. The invaders had crossed a line too deep to erase. Canton could not see it yet, but the mission that began with confidence would soon turn into a desperate escape. The hunters were about to become the hunted. For now, though, Canton pushed forward. Dust rose behind the horses. The death list rustled quietly in his coat, and in the growing darkness, he believed he was bringing order to a lawless land. But the truth was this. He had just lit the fuse of a war that would change the West forever. Smoke still drifted above the KC Ranch long after the flames had died. The charred remains of the small house stood like a black scar on the land. The body of Nate Champion lay in the dirt, his rifle nearby, his courage spoken now only in silence and ash. By nightfall, word of what happened had already reached nearby ranches. By morning, it had raced across the entire county. Men rode from homesteads, farms, and small ranches with anger burning behind their eyes. Women cried as they heard the story. Children clung to their parents, sensing fear in the adults' voices. The name on everyone's lips was the same, Canton. The killing of Champion was not seen as justice. It was not viewed as the punishment of a thief. It was seen as murder cold, organized, and carried out by men who believed they were above the law. For years, the people of Johnson County felt pressure from the big cattle barons. For years, they whispered that one day trouble would come, but they never expected it to come like this. Private army riding through their land, armed for war, ready to hang or shoot anyone on their secret list. Now the people were done whispering. They were ready to fight back, as Canton and the invaders pushed deeper into the county. They believed their mission was working. They rode confidently, talking about which names to cross off next. They planned to hit several ranches before anyone could organize a response. They were certain that small ranchers would run and hide, but they were wrong. Very wrong. At a ranch not far from the KC site, a group of locals gathered. Some were cowboys, some were ranchers, some were simple farmers who had never held a rifle in anger before. But they were united by something powerful: fear for their families and fury for what had been done. They formed a posse, but this was no small team of deputies. This was a rising of the entire community. Dozens became hundreds. Men rode from miles away to join them. Even people who did not know Champion personally felt they had to act. They were tired of being pushed around, tired of being treated like criminals, tired of living under the shadow of men who thought wealth meant power over life and death. While the posse gathered, the invaders stopped for the night at the TA ranch. The ranch sat in a wide valley, surrounded by open ground. To Canton, it seemed like a safe location to rest and plan their next move. He believed he had time. He believed he had control. He believed no one could stop them. But as the sky darkened, riders appeared on distant ridges. First, a few, then dozens, then more. Canton and his men noticed small movements in the hill's shadows, shifting, horses in the distance. The hunters were no longer unseen. The land itself seemed to be closing in on them. By dawn, the truth became clear. They were surrounded. The rising posse now numbered nearly 400 angry citizens, far outgunning the 50 invaders. The men of Johnson County, once scattered, now stood united with one purpose: to capture the killers who murdered, championed, and threatened their homes. Canton realized the situation had changed. The easy mission was gone. They were trapped as the sun rose. The first gunshots echoed across the valley. The invaders scrambled to take cover inside barns, sheds, and the main house. Bullets zipped through boards. Windows shattered. Horses screamed and pulled at their ropes, in panic. Canton shouted orders, trying to keep his men steady. He had led posses in the past. He had hunted outlaws. Now he saw what it felt like to be the one hunted by a force much larger and angrier than expected. The battle grew fierce quickly. The posse dug rifle pits behind logs and dirt mounds. The invaders fired back from whatever shelter they could find. Smoke drifted from gun barrels. Dust rose from the ground. The TA ranch turned from a quiet homestead into a war zone. Hours passed. The invaders could not break through the lines. Every path out was blocked. Every escape route was watched by armed men whose patience had run out long before this day. Inside the ranch house, some invaders began to panic. They whispered about surrender. Others argued they should fight until the last bullet. Canton stood at the window, watching the overwhelming force outside. He knew he could not fight his way out. He also knew that surrendering to the posse, filled with men who had watched Nate Champion die, would likely mean death without trial. He had been in deadly situations before. He had stared down guns, but this time felt different. This time, the past he had buried was clawing its way back into the light. Canton tightened his jaw. He was not ready to die. Not here. Not like this. His mind worked quickly, searching for a way out, any way out. Then came the sound that changed everything. A distant horn. A shout from the hills. A glint of sunlight on metal. Riders were approaching from the distance, uniforms flashing. Flags waving. It was the U.S. cavalry. Word had reached federal officials that a range war was erupting, and the cavalry had been sent to restore order before a bloodbath consumed the county. As the soldiers rode closer, both sides slowly stopped firing. The posse watched in frustration. The invaders watched in relief. And Canton felt something he had not felt in years. fear wrapped in gratitude. The cavalry demanded that both sides stand down. The invaders, trapped and exhausted, were taken into federal custody not to be executed by the posse, but to face justice in a courtroom. But as history would show, justice in Wyoming rarely reached the powerful. As Canton walked out, surrounded by soldiers, he kept his head high. Outwardly, he appeared calm, but inside he knew the truth. He had come within inches of death. The death list had turned on the man who wrote it, and although the cavalry saved his life, nothing could save his reputation. His days in Wyoming were numbered. The county he once controlled now spit his name like poison. He had lost the respect he fought so hard to win. Soon, Canton would be forced to leave the place where he once held a badge, a position of power, and the trust of the richest men in the state. But he was not done yet. The frontier still had room for men like him, men with shadows behind them and ambition ahead. His next chapter would take him south, into Indian territory, where he would once again reinvent himself, this time as a deputy marshal. But no matter how far he traveled, the ghosts of Wyoming would follow him. The Johnson County War changed everything for Frank Canton. Before the conflict, he had walked through Wyoming with confidence. Powerful men trusted him, small ranchers feared him, and he believed no force in the territory could challenge the influence of the cattle barons. But when the posse rose, when hundreds of ordinary citizens surrounded the invaders at the TA Ranch, Canton felt something he had not felt in many years, pressure closing in from every direction. Even though the U.S. cavalry saved his life, the damage was done. The people saw him not as a lawman, but as a murderer hiding behind wealthy friends. The newspapers spoke his name with anger. Families whispered about him at dinner tables. Saloon doors opened to silence whenever he walked by. The badge he once wore with pride now felt heavy with the weight of everything that had happened at the KC Ranch. Canton understood the truth before anyone had to say it aloud. Wyoming was no longer safe for him. He could stay and face trouble daily, or he could leave quietly and begin again somewhere new. The man who once escaped a Texas prison and became a sheriff knew how to disappear. So one cold morning, without fanfare or farewell, Frank Canton saddled his horse, packed his belongings, and rode away from Wyoming. The land he once controlled faded behind him. The ranges, the towns, the faces, everything slipped into the distance, like a story closing its final chapter. He headed south into Indian Territory, the region that would later become Oklahoma. The land there was wild, full of rugged hills, thick forests, and dangerous outlaws. It was a perfect place for a man who needed a fresh beginning, but was no stranger to violence. Indian Territory had its own problems. Criminals fled there to hide from the law, using the twisted woods and remote valleys as shelters. Gangs roamed freely. Murderers, robbers, and fugitives lived side by side, knowing that the right law officer could be miles away. For Canton, this was both a challenge and an opportunity. When he arrived at Fort Smith, he stepped into a world ruled by a single, powerful figure, the legendary Judge Isaac C. Parker, known across the frontier as the Hanging Judge. Under Parker's court, the law was strict. Trials were swift. Punishments were severe. It was a place where justice came fast and mercy came slow. And Judge Parker needed tough, fearless men to enforce the law across Indian Territory, men who would not hesitate when facing outlaws who had nothing to lose. Canton applied to become a deputy U.S. Marshal. He carried himself with experience and confidence. He spoke plainly and directly. He understood danger better than most, despite his dark past still. Unknown to officials, he was accepted. The outlaw became a lawman again. This time, he was one of the most important law officers in the frontier's roughest region. He rode beside legends, men whose names would echo across history. Bass Reeves, the fearless black lawman. Bill Tillman, the gentleman marshal. Heck Thomas, relentless and sharp-eyed. Together, they hunted the most dangerous criminals in the West. Canton proved himself quickly. He knew how to track men through rough country. He knew how to handle an ambush. He knew how to stand firm when others would run. His cold focus made him effective, and his past filled with gunfights, escapes, and violence gave him an understanding of criminal minds. But even as he enforced the law, he never forgot the truth. He had once stood on the other side. Maybe that gave him an edge. Maybe it gave him a sense of superiority. Or maybe it gave him a quiet fear that someday someone might recognize him as Joe Horner, the escaped outlaw of Texas. Still, Canton pushed forward. He rode through storms, crossed swollen rivers, and entered towns where gunfire welcomed strangers. He served warrants, guarded prisoners, and faced down men who had nothing left but their guns and their anger. One day, in the town of Pawnee, Canton faced a moment that would be remembered for decades. The outlaw Bill Dunn, known for his violent temper and fearless boldness, walked up to him in the street. Dunn told him plain and clear, "I've got it in for you." Then Dunn reached for his gun. But the West did not forgive. Hesitation, Dunn's pistol snagged in his suspenders for only a heartbeat, just long enough for Canton to draw. A single shot rang out. Dunn collapsed instantly. The street fell silent. Witnesses swore Canton's movements were faster than anything they'd seen before. The shooting was ruled self-defense, but it also added to Canton's growing reputation as a cold, efficient lawman, a man who would shoot without a tremble in his hand. As months turned to years, Canton rode deeper into the territory, building respect among U.S. marshals and settlers. He no longer walked as a sheriff hiding behind powerful cattlemen. He walked as a federal officer who hunted criminals and delivered them to Parker's courtroom. Yet something inside him still shifted uneasily. A man can change his name. He can ride into a new land. He can serve under a judge known for justice. But the past rarely stays buried forever. When Canton lay in bed at night, listening to the wind scratching at the wooden walls of his quarters, he knew he carried two lives inside him, the outlaw he once was, and the lawman he had become. In Indian Territory, he had a chance to redeem himself. Or maybe he had a chance to rewrite his life completely. But the West never let a man ride too far from his past. Soon, old memories would resurface, and the truth he had hidden for so long would climb back into the light. For now, though, he kept riding a badge on his chest, a gun at his side, and a shadow behind him that never stopped following. Indian Territory was wild, unpredictable land. It was a place where outlaws hid in thick forests. Tribes controlled ancient lands, and danger waited behind every bend in the trail. For Frank Canton now, a deputy U.S. Marshal, it was a test of both skill and spirit. But it was also a place where he could hide from Wyoming's scandal and Texas's forgotten crimes. Here, he could be a lawman again, respected and feared for his abilities. Working for Judge Isaac Parker's court was no easy job. Parker's district covered thousands of square miles, and many of the criminals who fled into Indian Territory were violent, desperate men. They knew the land, and they knew that marshals often rode alone or with only a few partners. Every arrest could turn into a shootout. Every night on the trail could turn deadly. It was a job that demanded courage, patience, and a willingness to face danger without hesitation. Canton's experience made him valuable. He had tracked rustlers, outlaws, and suspects across Wyoming's wide plains. He had survived ambushes. He had handled gunfights. All of this now worked in his favor. But he also carried something many other lawmen did, not a deep understanding of the outlaw mind. He knew how criminals thought because he had once lived among them. He knew how they hid, how they ran, and how they chose their battles. He rode alongside some of the most legendary marshals of the West. Bass Reeves, known for his fearlessness; Bill Tillman, known for his calm intelligence; Heck Thomas, known for his relentless drive. Canton fit among them well. He was quiet, observant, and controlled. He did not brag about his past. He did not speak about Wyoming. He surely never mentioned Texas. He focused only on the job, arresting outlaws and delivering them to Fort Smith for trial. But trouble always finds a man with a violent past. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long, Canton rode into the town of Pawnee. The day felt quiet. Too quiet. As he tied his horse outside a saloon, he noticed a figure watching him tall, with a hard stare that spoke louder than words. The man was Bill Dunn, a known outlaw, feared by many and disliked by even more. Dunn had a temper that boiled fast, and he carried grudges like loaded guns. And on this day, He carried a grudge specifically for Canton. Dunn stepped toward him, boots scraping on the dusty ground. "I've got it in for you," he said, his voice low and angry. Those words were more than a threat. They were a signal that violence was seconds away. Dunn's hand dropped for his pistol, but fate made a strange move. Dunn's gun snagged in his suspenders. It was a tiny mistake, a fraction of a second. But on the frontier, a fraction of a second was the line between life and death. Canton moved faster. He drew his revolver with a smooth, practiced motion. A single shot echoed through the street. Dunn collapsed, dead before he hit the ground. People came running from stores and saloons. Dust settled around them. Canton stood calmly, his pistol lowered, his expression flat. To him, it was simple: kill or be killed. The investigation ruled it self-defense. But the people of Pawnee whispered about Canton's speed, his coldness, and the strange calm he carried after ending a man's life. Over time, Canton hunted dozens of criminals across Indian Territory. Some he captured alive. Some he faced in gunfights. His reputation grew. Newspapers wrote about his bravery. Judges praised his work. Many officers respected him. But there were moments, quiet moments, when Canton sat alone under a black sky, listening to coyotes in the distance, staring at the embers of a dying campfire. He felt something he rarely showed Dunnies. He wondered how long he could keep running from who he used to be. How long before someone recognized his face? How long before the name Joe Horner surfaced again? Asterisk every time he passed through a town, every time he stepped into a courthouse, every time he handed over a prisoner. A small part of him feared someone would ask the wrong question or uncover the wrong document. Still, he rode on, day after day, doing his job with a seriousness that impressed even his harshest critics. Perhaps he hoped that good deeds could cover old sins. Perhaps he hoped the badge could erase the shadows behind him. But the West never forgot. It only waited. Asterisk one night, after a long ride, Canton found himself at a camp with fellow marshals. They laughed, shared stories, and warmed their hands by the fire. Someone mentioned Wyoming. Someone else mentioned the Johnson County War. Canton stayed silent, staring into the flames, feeling the heat on his face. He was careful. He always was. But deep inside, he knew that silence was the only shield he had left. Years passed in Indian Territory. Canton kept working, kept hunting criminals, kept building his image as a tough but reliable law officer. But as time went on, he felt a pull toward something else. He wanted stability. He wanted respect without fear. He wanted a life not built on secrets. The land was changing too. The frontier was closing. Towns were growing. Law enforcement was becoming more organized. The wild days of riders chasing fugitives across empty miles were slowly ending. Canton sensed that this chapter of his life was nearing its end. He was older, more weathered. His hearing was beginning to weaken. His body carried the scars of years on the trail. But before he could think about slowing down, life would take him on another journey, a journey far to the north, into a new and harsh land, where gold fever burned bright and danger lurked in the icy wind. The next chapter of his story would not unfold in the dry heat of the West, but in the frozen wilderness of Alaska, another frontier, another chance to begin again. But even in that faraway land, he would learn a painful truth. Man can escape the law. A man can change his name, but he can never outrun himself. Asterisk, by the late 1890s, Indian Territory had begun to settle. Towns grew larger. Lawmen became more organized. The wildness that once defined the land was slowly fading. For Frank Canton, now older and carrying many years of violence behind him, the territory no longer felt like a fresh start. It felt like a reminder. Every badge he pinned on, every gunfight he survived, every outlaw he hunted, all of it echoed the life he had once lived as Joe Horner. He needed something new. He needed distance. He needed a place so far away that even his past could not follow easily. And just as he felt this pull, the news spread across America like wildfire. The Klondike Gold Rush. Men from all over the country rushed to Alaska, seeking fortunes hidden in frozen rivers and icy mountains. The land was raw, dangerous, and unforgiving. It was a frontier, untouched by structure, ruled by greed desperation, and the harsh hand of nature. For many, it was a chance for riches. For Canton, it was something else, a chance to disappear again, a chance to create yet another life, a chance to bury the last pieces of Joe Horner. Without hesitation, Canton headed north. The journey to Alaska was long and brutal. He traveled by ship along the icy coast, watching towering cliffs slip by like silent giants. The cold bit into his skin. The wind cut through his clothes, but he didn't complain. He had endured storms in Texas, blizzards in Wyoming, and ambushes in Indian Territory. A little cold could not shake him. When he arrived, he found a world unlike any he had seen before. Snow fell thick and heavy. Mountains rose like white walls. Rivers froze solid. And everywhere he went, he heard the same questions. Where's the gold? Who struck it rich? But with gold came outlaws. Fights broke out over claims. Robbers prowled the trails. Murders happened quietly in the night. In the chaos, law and order were almost non-existent, and that was exactly where Canton came in. Officials in Alaska quickly realized they needed experienced lawmen, men who weren't afraid of criminals or harsh weather. Canton, with his years as a marshal and his calm, controlled nature, was hired as a deputy U.S. Marshal in Alaska. The outlaw turned sheriff turned marshal was now wearing a badge in one of the most dangerous frontiers in the world. In this frozen land, Canton's skills proved valuable. He rode through snowstorms so fierce they erased the world around him. He tracked suspects across icy trails and hidden valleys. He stood guard over prisoners who would rather freeze or fight than face a judge. Every day was a test of survival. But Alaska was different from Wyoming and Indian Territory. Here, Canton didn't command powerful cattle barons. He didn't serve judges known for hanging criminals. He wasn't surrounded by allies who could cover up his mistakes or hide his past. In Alaska, he was just another lawman trying to keep order in a place that didn't want order. And for the first time in years, Canton felt something he had nearly forgotten. He felt alone. The land swallowed sounds. It swallowed secrets. When he rode through the snow, all he heard was the wind and his own heartbeat. At night, when he sat near a small fire, he stared into the flames and wondered if this life was punishment or redemption. But shadows from his past followed him even here. People argued about money. Miners accused him of being too strict. Others claimed he made decisions that favored certain men. Some whispered he mismanaged funds or was part of shady deals related to gold claims and supplies. The details were unclear, but one thing was certain. Canton faced accusations. Officials questioned his actions. And for the first time in a long time, he was not protected by powerful friends. The weight of it all pressed hard on him. He had hoped Alaska would erase his past. Instead, it reminded him that running only worked for so long. When the pressure grew too heavy, Canton resigned. He didn't fight the accusations loudly. He didn't demand a trial to clear his name. He simply walked away, packed his belongings once more, and turned his back on another frontier. The man who had reinvented himself twice was preparing to do it again. Leaving Alaska was not easy. The cold had become part of him. The quiet had given him time to think. And the rough land had shown him just how tired he truly was. But he rode south anyway, headed back toward the warmer plains of America, where towns stood tall and law was more organized. As he traveled, he carried a truth he could no longer escape. He could not outrun his past forever. The name Joe Horner still lived. Even if it was buried deep, the crimes he committed as a young man still mattered. And though he had worn badges, hunted criminals, and risked his life for justice, he had never truly faced the boy he once was. Somewhere along the way, Canton made a decision that shocked even those who knew him well. A decision that would change the course of his life and reveal the truth he had. Hidden for decades, he would tell the world who he really was. He would reveal the secret he had carried from Texas to Wyoming, from Indian Territory to Alaska. He would face his past head-on before he reached the next frontier, before he put on another badge or stepped into another town. He was ready to unmask himself. Joe Horner, Frank Canton. 2 names, 1 man, 1 story still unfinished. And as he rode back into the American plains, he knew the next chapter would test him in ways even Alaska never could. When Frank Canton left Alaska, he carried more than his luggage. He carried years of secrets, guilt, and a past he had outrun for too long. The frozen frontier had shown him how small a man could feel when faced with silence and cold. But it had also done something else. It forced him to look inward, to see himself clearly, to face the truth he had hidden from the world and from himself. For decades, he had lived as Frank M. Canton, respected lawman, but he had been born as Josiah Joe Horner, outlawed and escaped convict. 2 lives, 1 man, 1 truth now, as he rode back into the lower United States. He realized something important. His past was no longer a shadow he could outrun. It was a weight he needed to lift, finally and completely. He was older now. His hair had turned gray. His hearing had grown weak. The sharpness in his eyes had softened. The West he once knew white, empty, uncontrollable was gone. Fences cut across the plains. Railroads connected towns. Telephones and electricity began to replace campfires and candlelight. The world was changing fast, and he felt tired of hiding. Settling in Oklahoma territory, Canton found a new community forming around him. The land was rough, but full of possibility. Towns sprang up quickly. People arrived from everywhere. Farmers, merchants, ranchers, families seeking fresh starts. It reminded him of himself in a strange way. He had lived a life built on new beginnings, but each one had grown heavier than the last. He worked quietly at first, doing odd jobs, helping local officials, staying close to law enforcement, but not stepping fully into the spotlight. He had seen enough violence. He had ridden through enough storms. He wanted something different. Now stability, respect, maybe even peace. But peace cannot exist on a foundation of lies. One evening, in a small town office, lit by a single oil lamp, Canton sat across from a local official who trusted him deeply. Papers lay on the table, documents about law enforcement, about appointments, about duties in the growing territory. It would have been easy to sign them and move on, continuing the life of Frank Canton, but he didn't. Instead, he took a deep breath. He felt the years of secrecy tightening inside his chest. And then, slowly, steadily, he told the truth. He admitted that he had once been Josiah Horner, convicted in Texas for robbery. He admitted that he had escaped prison. He admitted that he had taken a new name, moved north, and rebuilt his life. He admitted everything. The officials stared at him in shock. For years, Canton had been known as a lawman with experience and courage. Now they were hearing that he had once been the kind of man he hunted. It could have ended his life. It could have destroyed everything he had built. But instead, something unexpected happened. Canton requested a formal pardon. He didn't demand it. He didn't hide behind powerful allies. He didn't run. He stood before the governor of Texas and publicly acknowledged the truth. He explained his crimes, his escape, and his transformation. The governor listened carefully. They reviewed old records, dug through forgotten files, and considered the man Canton had become. Then, after weeks of waiting, after years of running, after decades of wearing a false name, Texas granted him a full pardon for the first time since he was a young cowboy in danger of the rope. Canton was truly free, not free from judgments some would never forgive him, not free from history, the dead of the Johnson County War still whispered in the wind, but free from the law he once fled, free from the secret he had buried, free from the ghost named Joe Horner. The pardon opened new doors, and one of them led to the most official position he would ever hold. In 1907, when Oklahoma became a state, Canton was chosen as the first adjutant general of the Oklahoma National Guard. It was an extraordinary moment. A man who once escaped a jail cell now led the military arm of a new state. He wore a uniform. He attended ceremonies. He helped build the foundation of Oklahoma's defense system. People saluted him. Children looked up to him. Newspapers printed his name with respect. Yet deep inside, he understood something important. He was not the hero people imagined. He was not the villain they whispered about either. He was something in between, a man shaped by mistakes, violence, fear, courage, and survival. As the years passed, Canton grew older. The roar of revolvers and the thunder of hooves faded into distant memories. He walked more slowly. He spoke more softly. His hearing nearly vanished. But his mind remained sharp, filled with memories of two lives that had battled each other for control. Sometimes, sitting on a quiet porch in the Oklahoma sun, he thought about the men he had arrested, the men he had shot, the men he had hunted, and the men he had once ridden with. He wondered which part of his story mattered more, the outlaw he once was, or the lawman he became. He knew the answer wasn't simple. It never had been. But for the first time in decades, he felt something close to peace. Not because his life had been perfect, not because he had made all the right choices, but because he had finally stopped running from himself. Redemption doesn't erase the past. It only allows a man to stand in front of it without fear. Frank Canton had done that, and the price he paid living to lives, carrying two names, was written forever into the story of the American West. Asterisk in the early 1900s. As the Old West faded into history, Frank Canton watched the world around him change faster than he ever imagined. Railroads stretched across the plains like steel rivers. Automobiles coughed their way down dusty roads. Telephones connected towns in seconds. The wild frontier he had once ruled with a gun and grit was disappearing, replaced by towns, laws, and quiet streets. For the first time in his life, Canton lived in a world that no longer needed men like him who tracked outlaws through snowstorms, fought gunmen in narrow alleys, or rode long nights with danger just behind them. The chaos of the West had calmed, and in its place stood something new: structure, order, civilization. But as the world changed, Canton changed with it. After being appointed the first adjutant general of the Oklahoma National Guard, he carried himself with a calm dignity that surprised many people. He attended meetings, oversaw organization, and helped build the foundation of a new state's military system. He was no longer chasing criminals or dodging bullets. Instead, he shook hands with politicians, guided young recruits, and represented Oklahoma at public events. People saw him and said, "There goes General Canton." None of them saw Joe Horner, the outlaw teen who once ran from Texas law. None of them saw the sheriff who helped lead the invaders into Johnson County. They only saw the uniform, the posture, the silver hair, the steady gaze. But Canton saw both men every time he looked in a mirror. In public, he stood tall. In private, he often sat quietly on his porch, listening to the wind, thinking about the miles he had traveled and the choices he had made. His hearing was nearly gone by now. Years of gunfire, weather, and stress had taken their toll. Voices around him sounded muffled, but in his mind, he heard everything clearly. The past spoke loudly in silence. He remembered the long cattle drives of his youth. He remembered the face of the Buffalo soldier who fell in Texas. He remembered the prison walls he escaped. He remembered the power he held as sheriff in Wyoming. He remembered the burning KC Ranch and the final cry of Nate Champion. He remembered the snow of Alaska. He remembered the weight of the truth when he confessed his real name. Every memory was a stone, and together they built the foundation of the man he had become. As Oklahoma grew, Canton found himself stepping away from official duties. Younger men took leadership positions. New laws and systems replaced the old frontier methods he understood so well. And though he accepted this gracefully, he knew a deeper truth. He was a man from another time, a time of open ranges, horse hooves, gun smoke, and harsh justice. A time when a name could be changed, but a past could not die in his final years. Canton often visited small towns, meeting people who remembered him as a lawman or respected him as a former general. Some asked for stories, some asked for advice. Some just wanted to shake the hand of a man who had seen the West before it became history. But he rarely spoke about his darkest days. He rarely spoke about Joe Horner. He rarely spoke about the Johnson County War. Those memories were locked inside him, too heavy to share, too complicated to explain. He believed people would not understand the choices he made or the world that shaped him, and perhaps, deep inside, he feared they might judge him harsher than he had judged himself. The man who had once been feared across Wyoming now spent quiet evenings reading newspapers, drinking tea, and watching the sun sink behind Oklahoma's endless plains. He seemed like any other aging gentleman, far removed from the violent shadows of his past. In 1927, Canton fell ill. His body, worn down by years of rough living and hard choices, began to fail. Friends visited him, speaking loudly so he could hear their words. They saw a man who had lived through the rise and fall of the Wild West, a man who had survived when many did not, a man who carried more stories than most books could hold. On September 27, 1927, in the town of Edmond, Oklahoma, Frank Canton took his final breath. He died peacefully, something rare for men of his kind. No gunfight, no ambush, no violent ending, just a quiet passing of a man who had lived two lives and carried the weight of both to the end. After his death, newspapers wrote about him with admiration. They called him a brave lawman, a dedicated officer, a strong leader. They praised his service to Oklahoma and his work with the National Guard. They did not mention Joe Horner. They did not mention prison or escape. They did not mention the invaders or the death list. History is kind to those who leave behind more friends than enemies, yet the truth cannot be erased. Frank Canton lived as both hero and villain, protector and destroyer, lawman and outlaw, a man who fled his past, shaped his future, and carved his name into the story of the American West. And perhaps that is what makes him unforgettable. Not perfection, but complexity. He reminds us that human lives are not simple, that choices shape destinies, that redemption is never easy, and that even a man with the darkest past can still stand in the lights if he stops running long enough to face who he really is. In the end, Frank Canton's legacy is not clean or simple. It is raw, it is flawed, it is human, a man of two names, a man of two worlds, a man whose story reminds us that the Wild West was built not by legends alone, but by men who carried both greatness and guilt in the same heart.